Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of conflicts that are taking place around the world, be it the Ukraine, Iran, wherever it is happening, we are covering it. Now, today, you could say the title of this piece of content is Lessons Learned. Lessons learned, right? So, first, I want to move over to the Ukraine. Now, a lot of people would say that this is essentially now a stagnant conflict, that both sides are not able to really inflict a operation that would create an environment of total victory for one side or the other. Now, I will say that is simply not the case. You have to look at the strategy that the Russians are utilizing in this conflict. It is now a war of attrition because the Russians are not just fighting the Ukrainians. They are also fighting the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They are fighting the intelligence organizations of the United Kingdom, France, and other Western European nation states. They are also fighting the actual weapon systems that are being transferred to the Ukrainians. They are also dealing with elements of the U.S. military and the U.S. intelligence services and national reconnaissance services that are giving the Ukrainians real-time information about Russian force disposition. The Ukrainians would not be able to target some of these some of these Russian units unless they were supplied with this intel information, this sensor information, be it from spy satellites or what have you, that the Ukrainians are receiving from the West. It's happening. But here's what we do know. If you visit the front lines, if you visit many of the frontline combat units in the eastern Donbass, and I'm talking specifically about Ukrainian combat units, and you compare and contrast a Russian combat unit to a Ukrainian combat unit, frontline combat unit holding a defensive line in the eastern Donbass, the Russian unit, the Russian frontline combat unit, is in much better shape. It is better equipped, it is better nourished, it is better supplied. Look, we have right now cases in which the family members of Ukrainian servicemen are complaining to the Ukrainian government that frontline troops, frontline Ukrainian combat troops, are going days without food. Why is that happening? Because the Russians are doing an excellent job at degrading and destroying the Ukrainian logistics capability. Now, eventually, that is going to lead to an environment where you will see the Ukrainian military really start to fall apart. Now, look, I know we've been saying this for quite some time. And as an American, and understanding American doctrine and understanding U.S. capability, it is bewildering for me to watch this conflict. Obviously, the United States, if the United States was fighting the Ukrainians and not supporting the Ukrainians, the conflict would look much different. The Russians entered this conflict vastly behind the West, and specifically the United States and even China, in terms of air capability, air dominance, the ability to degrade and suppress enemy air defenses, and then achieve total air supremacy over a target area. Look, right now, in the early stages of the conflict, if we go back to 2022, the Russians were flying over Kiev. Russian multi-role combat aircraft were flying over Kiev. They're not doing that anymore. Very rarely will you even see a Russian aircraft enter Ukrainian airspace. Now, does that mean that the Russian Air Force is still not present in this conflict? That's not true either. They're very much present. They're just launching glide bombs well behind the front line in Russian airspace against Ukrainian positions. Are these effective? To some extent, they are effective. Are they as accurate as a U.S. air campaign would be? No, absolutely not. Far behind U.S. capability. The Russians are. I sound like Yoda there. Far behind the Chinese, the Russians are. They just are. Now, that's one area of Russian doctrine that I, as an American, I really just scratch my head and have to wonder, what's happening. Now, I understand that the Soviet Union fell apart. The Russians had very little money, and for a better part of a decade, they did not have the ability to spend essentially $1 trillion a year on their defense establishment to upgrade and develop new technology, specifically for its Air Force. The Russians developed some systems that are rooted in Soviet technology, but by and far, research and development, especially if you compare and contrast of what the United States has done, far behind, far behind. And then one area of this conflict that you're seeing right now is the suppression of enemy air defenses. The Russians far behind, both in technology and training that's required to suppress even Soviet-era S-300 air defense systems. And now we've even beyond that, right? So the Russians were facing essentially their own types of air defense systems early in the conflict. Now they're facing much more capable, higher-end Western systems, Western sensor systems that are able to detect Russian inbound aircraft, cruise missiles, drones, what have you. I would say at this point, the Ukrainian capability of detecting adversarial weapon systems crossing into the Ukraine are more advanced and better right now than they were at the start of the conflict. Now, if you are a nation state and you ask yourself, well, how does the United States, how is it able to do what it does? Like if you look at what happened in Iran. Look, the Iranian, no matter where you think this war has gone or could be going, the war between Iran, Israel, and the United States and the Israelis decapitated not just the leadership of Iran, which may have actually been a bad thing, but they essentially destroyed the air defense network. That was not very difficult to do. Now, it was a hodgepodge of Chinese, Russian, and domestic capability that the Iranians had deployed. But, again, if you look at the United States, you look at technology and a lot of training. And not only a lot of training, a lot of experience. So you take huge amounts of technology, massive amounts of technology, developed through spending trillions of dollars on some of these systems that have been created, especially like the F-35 and other weapon systems, both open source and non-open source, that suppress enemy air defenses. Nothing like that in terms of technology exists in the Russian Federation, especially training and, more importantly, acquired, learned experiences. So the United States has had the benefit, going back from the 1960s, of suppressing North Vietnam air defense systems, going back to a range of other engagements that have taken place from the conflict in Iraq, and I'm talking about the first Gulf War, 1991, a fairly advanced, robust, integrated air defense network that was actually pretty successful, more successful in shooting down American aircraft than the Iranians were. The Iraqis, if you remember back in 1991, were much more effective at intercepting American aircraft and shooting American aircraft down and capturing American pilots than the Iranians were in this current conflict. You have the engagements that took place in Yugoslavia, in that really most unrighteous conflict in which Kosovo was taken from Serbia, completely unrightfully so, and handed to another entity, and essentially, again, took it from the Serbs. But be that as it may, it happened. But again, another period of acquired experiences by the U.S. Air Force. So all these experiences of engaging and going through these conflicts in which the U.S. must overcome these adversarial nation states' air defense network has led to this knowledge base that is passed down. And the United States does a very effective job at taking a learned experience and then teaching that learned experience to future pilots and other members of the U.S. military, even instances that have occurred decades earlier, right? So that exists, that kind of learned experience, that acquired experience, and then continued training on what was learned is constantly used in the military. And then again, incredibly robust training integrated with very advanced technology. So when you take that kind of training and that kind of technology and you integrate it and you use it to suppress enemy air defense networks, right now there is no other nation state on the planet that comes even close to what the U.S. is able to do in terms of SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses. But again, I would say, as we watch this conflict in the Ukraine, that is one area right now that would have probably turned the tide for the Russians. If the Russians had the ability to suppress Ukrainian air defense networks and then operate with fixed-wing combat aircraft and direct ground support over the Ukraine, this conflict would look much different. Now, there was a lot of gaps in Russian technology. One of the biggest ones that to this day, I don't know if the Russians are just being stubborn and sticking to their doctrine, and that is in regards to targeting pods, right? The advanced targeting pods, such as the sniper. Now look, are the Russians going to manufacture a targeting pod that is similar to the sniper? No, it's not. It's not. The Chinese have a system that is probably about 60 to 70% as capable as the sniper targeting pod. And that would be an avenue that the Russians could probably lean on China and probably acquire and change its doctrine in terms of using these targeting pods much more effectively in this current conflict. And then again, training and technology. Are the Russians going to be able to produce the types of technology that the U.S. produces? No, they're not. Could they train and become better at suppression of enemy air defenses, where they could have done a better job in this conflict, in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict? Probably. Most definitely. The doctrine that was used in the early stages of the Ukrainian conflict, what we call the Red Arrow operation, moving large amounts of Italian armored tactical groups through road networks to take strategic positions inside of the Ukraine, failed horrendously for the Russians. It was more effective in other areas of the conflict, but in a high defensive capacity region such as Kiev, with the Ukrainians able to marshal large amounts of forces and then interdict Russian troops landing to the northwest of Kiev near Hostomel. Again, classic example of the Russians displaying certain capabilities that would be effective if they were fighting a different nation state maybe than the Ukrainians. But fighting an industrialized nation state such as the Ukrainians that had a pretty capable military that was willing to fight. And again, I think that's another area or another realm of the conflict where maybe the certain elements of the Russian military did not believe the Ukrainians were going to fight. Look, any conflict you enter, you have to believe that your enemy is going to fight and is very motivated. I can tell you, going into the 91 First Gulf War, as U.S. soldiers were preparing for that conflict, we looked at the Iraqi army as being very capable, being highly motivated, probably the Republican Guard being even more motivated. And I think that even that instance of the U.S. just looking at the Republican Guard versus the regular Iraqi army, I can tell you that some units of the regular Iraqi army actually performed as good, or in some cases even better, than the regular Republican Guard. It happened. Now, that was just an example where the U.S. maybe looked at that conflict and said, okay, the Republican Guard is the threat, the Iraqi army maybe not so much, but that was not the case. And again, I think maybe in this conflict, well, not maybe, the Russians absolutely went into this conflict with a bit of overconfidence. Even in the West, it was believed that this would be essentially a multi-day, multi-week conflict, in which some Western leaders was telling Ukrainian leaders, get the hell out of the country. You're not going to survive. And going into that conflict, if you go back to the early stages and early pieces of content that were produced, I didn't believe that this was going to be a quick conflict. I thought this was going to become a messy conflict. Now, I will say, I did not believe the conflict was going to last more than 4 years. I would imagine the conflict would have lasted anywhere from a good 6 months to 2 years. That would have been my estimate going into this conflict. But at the same time, right, we didn't believe going kind of into this conflict that the Ukrainians would receive as much Western support as they are receiving. And it's quite significant. And I think part of that was due to Russian ineffectiveness early in the conflict. If the Russians would have been more effective and done better, that would have probably led to hesitancy on the part of the West to hand over weapon systems to the Ukrainians. Now, if the West, if the United States and Russia were to go to war, what would that look like? I think that's the big question right now. Well, I think that where the Russians would suffer tremendously would be frontline engagements, would be the U.S. ability to engage and attack Russian frontline units. The United States would also do very well in attacking areas outside the Moscow Central Industrial Zone. The Central Industrial Zone around Moscow, probably around 100 miles around Moscow, is very well defended. It would be challenging for U.S. aircraft and or precision-guided weapon systems to make it through that air defense network. Weapon systems would make it through, and obviously the U.S. would probably not fly aircraft over the central industrial zone. So that would make it tough to hit targets in that area. And obviously the size and scope of the Russian Federation is immense, and that would make it challenging. But targeting frontline Russian units and cities to the north, such as St. Petersburg, and even St. Petersburg is relatively well defended in terms of air defense systems. But again, what makes Russia so challenging is its size is also something that leads to it having troubles as well defending the Russian Federation, having the ability to defend such a large region against fixed-wing stealth aircraft launching long-range precision-guided strike weapon systems. Again, makes it a tough situation. But if we get into that realm, then we're probably looking at the nuclear realm at some point, right? And we obviously don't want that to happen. Now, China, right? A lot of Chinese equipment was sent to the Iranians. And wherever you sit on the equation of this conflict, either a supporter of Iran or against the United States in this conflict, the Iranian air defense network did not do well. Now, does that mean that if there would to be a conflict between China and the United States, that would replicate itself? No. Totally different animal in terms of China's domestic air defense network, the size, the scope, the amount of aircraft, the industrial capacity of China far exceeds that of Iran. Again, you could not really compare, you cannot compare and contrast what happened or what has happened and is happening in Iran to a conflict with China. Now, you would see other areas in terms of a war that would take place, such as subsurface warfare. The United States has not really had to engage an adversary that has a very large naval capability. A large naval capability also gives you a very target-rich environment. And I can tell you, again, and we've talked about this before, the U.S. subsurface capability, its nuclear attack boats, nuclear attack submarines, are vastly more superior than the Chinese subsurface fleet. And again, as we've talked about before, I doubt very much you would see the U.S. surface fleet approaching mainland China. You would see the U.S. subsurface fleet, not surface fleet, doing a lot of the damage to the Chinese Navy. And again, even if the Chinese decided to blockade Taiwan, I'm not so sure that would be effective, giving that subsurface capability that's never really talked about in the mainstream media. That's never discussed. But that capability is omnipresent, and there is no other nation state on the planet that even comes close to U.S. submarine capability. I mean, if you go back to the 1980s, towards the fall of the Soviet Union, were the Soviets, through quantity, maybe not quality, able to give the U.S. some problems? Yeah, probably. But because of the fall of the Soviet Union and ongoing money being spent on the creation of new and more advanced subsurface weapon systems, the U.S. has just completely leapfrogged multiple generations ahead of what the Soviet Union was even contemplating to build going into the 1990s. And then obviously a lot of that technology the Chinese would then later either acquire or replicate themselves. But again, Chinese vastly behind the U.S. in subsurface capability. Will that stay true? Difficult to say. I would say right now for the next 10 years at least, the U.S., again, is well ahead of any nation state on the planet. I mean, the French and the British build pretty good subsurface capabilities, but they're just not at the same scale that the U.S. is. Now, scale is also an issue, especially when you compare and contrast with China. The scale of U.S. shipbuilding and submarine nuclear attack boat building is not the same as it once was. Now, could that change pending a large-scale conflict? Possibly. But again, as we watch the conflict continue between the Russians, the Ukrainians, and NATO, yes, it appears stagnant, but the casualty levels right now that are taking place in this conflict, and I'm talking about the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians talk about the large amounts of casualties that they are inflicting upon the Russians. But I can guarantee you, in all probability, casualty levels are probably 1-for-1 right now. Probably closer to 1-for-1. Now, again, the mainstream media says otherwise. And they bite on the Ukrainian propaganda about the amount of casualties that they are causing the Russians. But if you look at the amount of glide bombs that the Russians are using in this conflict and the amount of heavy artillery and multiple launch rocket systems that are being used in conjunction with drones and real-time sensor information that the Russians are utilizing along the front lines, and the amount of missiles and drones that are being launched daily, at times pushing 600 to 1,000 different types of drones, if you include Lancets as well, being used against the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are taking massive casualties. And right now you're seeing frontline servicemen of the Ukrainian armed forces essentially starving to death at times on the front lines because of Russian interdiction against its logistics capability. Now, will this last a year? Will it last 4 years? Who knows at this point? I think we're going to reach a phase in this war where you rapidly start to see the Ukrainian military deteriorate. And it will be noticeable and it will be kinetic. And at that point, you'll really start to see the Russians start to move fairly quickly in this conflict. We just haven't reached that point yet. But that's the Russian war strategy right now, and we'll continue to watch this very close, as will we continue to watch any for possible future engagements between Iran, the United States, Israel, as that could go up anytime. Right now, I think the U.S. is reassessing and identifying more targets. I think we got to the point where the U.S. had just hit most of the targets that it was aware of and were actively tracking. And this pause right now has given the U.S. to go back and retarget and look at Iran very closely without missiles flying to come up with a new target set against the Iranians that will probably be utilized in the not too distant future at some point. Additionally, more capability has been moved into the region, i.e. the Persian Gulf, for possible island seizing operations. And that could be something we could see at some point pending the blockade becomes ineffective. So we'll see what happens. As always, thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Good day.